The message came in at 6:17 p.m. on a Tuesday, a time so ordinary it took me a few seconds to realize my hands were shaking as I read it, because ordinary moments aren't supposed to end families, and yet there it was sitting on my phone like a quiet execution order. We've agreed you're no longer part of the family. Please don't come to any gatherings going forward. It was from my mom, no emojis, no explanation, no typo, no hesitation. Just that single clean paragraph that erased 32 years of birthdays, holidays, scraped knees, forced smiles and family photos, and every time I was told blood meant something unbreakable. I reread it 5 times, waiting for my brain to catch up, waiting for anger or disbelief or denial to kick in. But what hit first was a hollow pressure in my chest, like someone had scooped something essential out of me, and left everything else intact enough to function but not enough to feel human. I typed, deleted, typed again, then stopped because what do you say when your own mother formally fires you from your own life? I sat there staring at the screen, the room around me quiet except for the hum of the fridge, thinking about how strange it was that she chose "we've agreed," not "I've decided," which meant this wasn't emotional, it wasn't impulsive, it was voted on, discussed, approved, probably over dinner, probably while passing dishes I'd bought them, probably with my name spoken calmly like a business liability. I thought about the last family gathering I'd been invited to, how my sister Claire barely looked at me, how my dad barely spoke, how my mom hugged me with one arm like she was already practicing distance, and how I'd brushed it off because I always did, because I was the son who learned early that keeping the peace meant swallowing questions. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, was that this message wasn't the beginning of the betrayal, it was the cleanup phase, the final step after months of decisions made without me, about me, using my silence as permission. I stood up and paced, the words replaying in my head, and that's when I noticed something else that made my stomach drop even harder. The timing. My bank app had sent me a notification an hour earlier about an account status change on an old savings account I barely used, one my parents had helped me open years ago when they insisted I wasn't ready to manage finances on my own. At the time it felt parental, responsible, loving even. Now, paired with that message, it felt surgical. I opened the app, tried to log in, and got locked out immediately. No access. No explanation. Just a customer service number and a sinking realization that whatever decision had been agreed on didn't stop at family dinners. It was bigger, colder, planned. I drove to their house without thinking, my mind cycling through possibilities. Maybe this was about politics, maybe money I'd borrowed years ago, maybe something Claire had twisted into a story. But when I pulled into the driveway and saw my childhood home dark, quiet, deliberately unwelcoming, I understood this wasn't a fight. This was an eviction. I sat there in my car, engine running, staring at the windows where I'd once watched Christmas lights glow. And for the first time in my life, I felt like an outsider looking in on something that used to be mine. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Mom. Shorter this time. Please respect our boundaries. Boundaries. As if I were the one who crossed them. As if I hadn't spent my entire life stepping carefully around everyone else's moods, expectations, and financial control. That word snapped something inside me. Not into rage yet, but into clarity. And I realized that if they were this comfortable cutting me out with a text, then whatever they were protecting had to be worth more than their own son. And that meant the truth, whatever it was, wasn't just ugly. It was expensive. I didn't sleep that night, not really. Because every time I closed my eyes my phone screen lit up in my mind again with my mother's words, sharp and polite and devastating, and somewhere between midnight and dawn I stopped trying to make sense of how a family disowns someone and started asking why. Because people don't cut off their own son unless they're afraid of something coming out, and that thought lodged itself in my chest like a splinter I couldn't ignore. By morning, exhaustion had burned through shock and left behind something colder and more focused, so I called the customer service number from the bank app, listened to the robotic menu, and finally got a woman on the line who asked me to verify my identity, only to pause and say carefully, "Sir, this account is no longer accessible under your credentials," and when I asked why, she replied with the kind of neutral tone that signals legal landmines. The account ownership was modified by the primary account holder, and I laughed, an ugly, disbelieving sound, because I was the primary account holder, or at least that's what I'd always been told, until she added, "According to our records, your father was listed as the primary custodian," and suddenly every memory I had of being told I wasn't ready to manage money, every time my parents insisted on helping for my own good, snapped into a new, uglier alignment. I hung up and sat there staring at the wall, thinking about how strange it was that my parents had always framed control as care, how every restriction came wrapped in concern, and how easily I'd accepted it because it was easier than fighting, easier than risking the quiet withdrawal of affection that had always followed any attempt at independence. My sister Claire used to joke that I was the easy one, the son who didn't cause problems, and I wore that label like armor, not realizing it also made me convenient. By late morning, I drove to my office, but I couldn't focus, couldn't answer emails without rereading the same sentences over and over, because my thoughts kept circling back to the same unsettling pattern. The timing of the message, the bank access, the months of subtle distance, the way my parents had insisted I move my emergency savings into a better structured account they'd researched for me, the way my dad had brushed off my questions with a tight smile and a trust us. Trust. That word had always been their favorite. Around noon I called my Aunt Linda, my mom's younger sister, the only relative who'd ever quietly checked in on me without agenda, and when she answered I could hear hesitation in her voice, the kind that means someone has already been warned. I asked her directly if she knew why my parents had cut me off, and there was a long pause before she said, "I was hoping you wouldn't call," which told me everything before she even continued, her voice dropping as she said, "They told everyone you were unstable, that you'd been asking for money, that you were creating conflict and they had to protect themselves," and I felt heat flood my face, not just anger but humiliation, because character assassination is the laziest, most effective way to erase someone, and they'd done it preemptively, setting the narrative so no one would question their actions. I asked Linda if she believed them and she sighed saying, "I didn't at first, but they were very convincing, and that hurt more than I expected because it meant the lie had legs. It meant my absence was already being justified in rooms I wasn't allowed to enter." When I hung up, my hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't confusion, it was resolve, because if they were willing to rewrite who I was, then the truth had to be something they couldn't afford to explain. I took the afternoon off and drove past my parents' neighborhood without stopping, just watching the houses slide by, thinking about how normal everything looked from the outside, how no one would ever guess that inside one of those houses, a decision had been made to erase a son like an accounting error. I remembered my childhood bedroom, how my mom used to go through my drawers under the guise of cleaning, how my dad always insisted on being copied on my financial emails just in case, how every milestone in my life had been accompanied by a quiet reminder of what I owed them. Gratitude had been their currency, and I'd paid it faithfully. By evening, I was deep in old emails, scrolling back years, searching for anything that mentioned accounts, custodians, trusts, anything I dismissed at the time as boring adult logistics, and that's when I found it. An email from my dad dated 8 years ago with the subject line "long-term planning," casually mentioning that certain assets were better kept off your radar for now to avoid pressure and distraction, and my stomach dropped because normal parents don't hide assets from their adult son unless those assets aren't really theirs to hide. The word assets echoed in my head, and suddenly my mom's text made sense in a way that was almost nauseating. This wasn't about me causing problems. It was about removing me from the equation before I realized I was part of one. The next morning I requested my credit report and froze when I saw unfamiliar activity. Accounts I didn't recognize opened years ago, closed quietly, balances moved, names I trusted attached to things I'd never approved, and I realized this wasn't just emotional exile, it was financial quarantine. They weren't just pushing me out of the family. They were sealing off whatever trail connected me to whatever they'd done. By the time the sun came up, I wasn't asking if my parents had betrayed me anymore. I was asking how much, how long, and who else knew. And somewhere in that realization, the pain shifted into something sharper, something dangerous, because if they thought a text message and a locked account were enough to make me disappear quietly, they had misunderstood me completely. By the third day after the message, the shock had fully burned off and left behind a kind of alertness I'd never felt before, the kind that makes every memory feel suspect, every kindness feel conditional, and I realized that if I didn't start pulling threads deliberately, whatever my parents were hiding would stay buried under their version of events, so I did the one thing I'd never done without their blessing. I hired my own attorney. His name was Marcus Hale, mid-40s, calm voice, eyes that didn't flinch when I laid everything out, the text, the bank lockout, the credit report, the old emails, and when I finished he leaned back and said, "This looks less like a family dispute and more like asset control." And that single sentence felt like someone turning a light on in a room I'd been stumbling through blind. He explained custodial accounts, fiduciary responsibility, and the ways parents sometimes justify holding on to money that legally belongs to their adult son, especially when there's a power imbalance and a long history of dependence. And as he spoke, I kept thinking about how my parents had always insisted money was stressful, how they'd framed themselves as shields between me and complexity, when in reality they were the ones deciding what I could see. Marcus requested authorization to pull records, and within days the picture started to sharpen in ways that made my stomach twist. There wasn't just one account. There were multiple, some opened when I was barely out of high school, others tied to investment vehicles my dad had described vaguely as family planning, all technically linked to me, all managed by him. The total number, even in rough estimates, was far more than I'd ever had in my own bank account at any point in my life, and the realization that I'd struggled, stressed, and delayed basic things like dental work and reliable transportation while money sat in my name under someone else's control made something in me go very quiet. Marcus didn't rush me when I stopped responding, just slid a legal pad across the desk and said, "You need to decide what you want because once we push, this won't stay private." And that was when the emotional weight of it hit. Not just the betrayal, but the exposure, the public unmasking of a family that had always cared deeply about appearances. I thought about my mom's social media posts, my dad's reputation at work, the way Claire curated her life like a highlight reel, and I understood why they'd chosen exile over explanation. That afternoon I called my sister. She didn't answer at first, then finally picked up on the fourth try, her voice tight, asking why I kept calling when Mom already explained everything, and I told her calmly that I'd hired an attorney, that I was reviewing accounts in my name, and there was a long silence before she said, "You're being dramatic." But her voice cracked on the last word, and that crack told me more than any confession could have. I asked her if she knew about the accounts and she said, "Dad said it was complicated," which was the family's favorite euphemism for don't ask, and when I pressed she snapped, "Why are you doing this? You're going to tear everything apart." And I realized with a kind of grim clarity that she wasn't asking because she didn't know the truth. She was asking because she did, and it benefited her. Marcus later confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Transfers from accounts in my name had been used to support expenses that had nothing to do with me, including renovations to my parents' house and tuition payments tied to Claire, all justified internally as family use, all done without my informed consent. When I confronted my dad by email, carefully, professionally, asking for documentation and explanation, his reply came fast and defensive, full of words like entitlement and gratitude and everything we've done for you. And not once did it actually answer the question. My mom followed up with a separate message accusing me of being manipulated by outsiders and threatening that if I continued, I'd lose the family forever. And I stared at that line for a long time because it made something painfully obvious. They didn't see me as someone who could be wronged. They saw me as someone who could be managed, and when management failed, removed. Marcus advised patience, methodical documentation, and restraint. But he also warned me that cases like this often ended with families doubling down, not backing off, and that warning proved accurate when I received a formal letter a week later, drafted by an attorney I recognized as a friend of my dad's, accusing me of harassment and demanding I cease contact immediately. The irony was almost laughable, being legally threatened for asking about my own money, but the message was clear. They were closing ranks, shifting from emotional pressure to legal intimidation, and in doing so they confirmed what my instincts had been screaming since that first text. Whatever they'd taken from me wasn't an accident, wasn't temporary, and wasn't something they intended to give back willingly. And as I sat there reading that letter, I realized that the family I thought I'd lost had actually disappeared long before the text arrived. The only difference now was that I was finally being forced to see it. The more they tried to shut me out, the clearer the shape of the truth became, because silence at that level isn't confusion, it's coordination. And by the time Marcus called me back with a tremor in his usually steady voice, I knew whatever he'd uncovered was going to change the scale of everything. He told me to come into his office immediately, and when I arrived, he had documents spread across his desk like evidence in a trial that hadn't officially begun yet, pointing to a series of trusts established years ago under my name, some when I was still legally a minor, others quietly amended after I turned 18, all of them layered through shell structures that made them hard to track unless you knew exactly where to look. He explained that these weren't casual savings vehicles. They were sophisticated instruments, the kind used to park significant wealth, and as he spoke, my mind kept flashing back to moments I dismissed as normal, my parents' sudden lifestyle upgrades, The renovations they claimed were financed through smart refinancing. The way my dad never seemed stressed about money even when he warned me constantly about how fragile finances were. Marcus slid one page forward and tapped a number that made my chest tighten. A 7-figure valuation tied to a trust bearing my full legal name. Beneficiary listed as me. Trustee listed as my father. "This is not pocket change," he said quietly, and I nodded, numb, because the number itself was less shocking than the realization that my parents had been living with this knowledge for years while watching me struggle, while reminding me to be grateful for hand-me-down furniture and lectures about budgeting. The betrayal wasn't just that they'd used my money. It was that they'd used my dependence as cover, shaping my self-image so I wouldn't question why I was always behind. When Marcus asked if there was anyone else in the family with independent knowledge of finances, grandparents, business partners, anyone, I hesitated, then mentioned my grandfather on my mom's side, Richard, a man I'd always thought of as distant but respectable, wealthy in a way that didn't announce itself, who sent cards instead of checks and asked pointed questions my parents brushed off. Marcus's eyes sharpened at the name, and he suggested we reach out carefully, not confrontationally, because if Richard had contributed to the trust, or even known about it, his perspective could dismantle the narrative my parents were building. I hadn't spoken to my grandfather in months, partly because my mom always framed him as judgmental, partly because I'd internalized the idea that asking older relatives about money was impolite, but now politeness felt like another leash I'd been taught to wear. When I called him, he answered on the second ring, his voice warm but cautious, and after a few minutes of awkward catching up, I told him directly that I'd been cut off from the family and was trying to understand why. There was a pause so long I thought the call had dropped, and then he said slowly, "They finally did it." And my heart thudded because that sentence carried years of anticipation. He asked if I was safe, if I had legal representation, and when I said yes, he let out a breath and told me something that made my hands go cold. He'd been worried this day would come ever since my parents insisted on handling my financial future on my behalf, framing it as a favor but refusing transparency, and when he'd pushed back, my mother accused him of undermining her authority as a parent. He told me he'd contributed significantly to a trust intended for my education, housing, and long-term security, with explicit instructions that it transitioned to my control when I reached adulthood, instructions he believed had been followed until he noticed discrepancies, requests for additional funds that didn't align with what he'd been told about my circumstances. When he questioned those requests, my parents claimed I was struggling, unstable, prone to impulsive decisions, and needed oversight. And hearing those words out loud from someone else was like being punched in the gut, because it confirmed what my aunt had hinted at. They hadn't just taken my money, they'd sold a version of me that justified taking it. Richard said he'd tried to reach me directly several times, but my parents always intercepted, saying I was overwhelmed or didn't want to talk about finances, and I thought back to the letters I never received, the missed calls explained away, the subtle isolation that suddenly looked intentional. By the end of the call, my grandfather's voice had hardened into something steely, and he told me he was prepared to cooperate fully with any legal action, that he'd kept records, correspondence, wire confirmations, everything, because he'd learned the hard way that trust within families often needed receipts. When I relayed this to Marcus, his reaction shifted from concern to strategy, because now we weren't just dealing with circumstantial evidence and suspicious behavior. We had an external benefactor with documentation and motive to intervene. The pressure escalated quickly after that, as if my parents sensed the walls closing in, because within days I received a new message from my mom, this one longer, more emotional, accusing me of betrayal, of dragging outsiders into private family matters, of humiliating them, and I noticed how carefully she avoided mentioning money, how the focus was always on loyalty and respect, as if those concepts could outweigh legality. My dad followed up with a voicemail that oscillated between anger and pleading, warning me that legal fights destroy families, that I'd regret this, that Claire was falling apart over the stress, and I listened to it twice, not because it moved me, but because it finally sounded like fear. Marcus advised we proceed with a formal demand for accounting, citing fiduciary breaches and unauthorized transfers, and when that notice went out, the response was immediate and aggressive. My parents' attorney accused us of misinterpretation, threatened countersuits, and claimed the funds were used in alignment with family interests, a phrase so vague it might as well have been a confession. Meanwhile, the social fallout intensified. Relatives stopped responding to my messages, friends of the family unfollowed me online, and I could almost see the narrative being reinforced in real time, that I was greedy, ungrateful, unstable. Yet oddly, that isolation no longer hurt the way it once would have, because every attempt to shame me confirmed I was touching something real. The breaking point came when Marcus received a copy of an internal memo accidentally included in a document dump, a memo written years earlier by my father to a financial advisor, outlining a plan to maintain control over the trust indefinitely by positioning me as financially immature and emotionally volatile. And when Marcus read it aloud, the room went quiet because that memo wasn't just evidence of theft. It was evidence of intent, of a long-term strategy to keep me dependent, so I'd never question why my life felt smaller than it should have. I walked out of his office that day knowing that whatever happened, next court confrontation, fallout, there was no going back to ignorance, and for the first time since that text message arrived, I felt something close to power, not because I wanted revenge but because the truth was finally louder than the story they told about me. Once the formal demand for accounting was served, the tone of everything shifted from passive-aggressive to openly hostile, like a mask slipping in slow motion, and I could feel the family machine recalibrating in real time to treat me not as a son but as a threat that needed containment. Marcus warned me this phase was often the ugliest because when people who've relied on control realize it's failing, they reach for intimidation. And he was right, because within 48 hours my parents stopped pretending this was about boundaries and started making it about punishment. My dad showed up unannounced at my apartment one evening, standing too close when I opened the door, his voice low and sharp as he told me I was making a very serious mistake. That lawyers poison minds, that I didn't understand the consequences of humiliating him publicly, and for a split second my old reflex kicked in, the urge to placate, to soften, to step back. But then I noticed something new in his eyes. Something brittle and frantic, and I realized the power dynamic had already shifted. I told him calmly that all communication should go through attorneys, and the way his face twisted told me he wasn't used to hearing no from me, not delivered without apology. He tried a different angle then, his voice dropping into something almost tender, saying my mom was sick with stress, that Claire wasn't sleeping, that the family was unraveling because of my stubbornness, and I listened without interrupting, not because I believed him but because I wanted to hear how far he'd go. When he finished, I said, "You did this without me for years. I'm just finding out." And the silence that followed was thick, because there was no counterargument that didn't admit guilt. He left without another word, but the message was clear. They were done trying to reason. Next would come pressure. That pressure arrived through subtler channels at first, emails from family friends asking if I was okay, loaded with concern that felt rehearsed, social media posts about forgiveness and family loyalty, that weren't tagged but were unmistakably aimed at me. And then more concretely, a notice from my parents' attorney requesting mediation, framed as a generous opportunity to resolve matters quietly, for everyone's sake. Marcus reviewed it and shook his head, explaining that mediation at this stage would only serve to limit discovery and protect assets, not resolve wrongdoing, and when we declined, the gloves fully came off. My sister Claire finally broke her silence with a text that was long, rambling, and revealing in ways she probably didn't intend, accusing me of always playing the victim, of not appreciating how much our parents had done, of forgetting that family money isn't just yours. And buried in that message was a line that made my heart pound. "You know they promised I'd be taken care of too." Promised. Taken care of. I forwarded it to Marcus, who replied with a single word, "Important," and explained later that it suggested Claire's awareness of, and expectation around, funds that legally weren't hers. That same week, my grandfather Richard sent over his full documentation, and as Marcus and his team cross-referenced it with what we'd obtained through subpoenas, a clear pattern emerged. Money flowed in under the premise of supporting me, then flowed out to cover expenses that aligned with my parents' priorities, with careful notes framing each transfer as necessary for family stability. It was systematic, meticulous, and chilling, not the kind of thing done on impulse or out of desperation, but the kind of thing built over time by people who believed they were entitled to manage other people's lives. The emotional weight of seeing it laid out that way was heavier than I expected. There was something uniquely painful about watching spreadsheets narrate your childhood, about realizing your limitations weren't accidents but design choices. Marcus filed a petition to compel full disclosure and freeze remaining assets, and when the court granted it provisionally, my mom called me for the first time since the exile text, her voice trembling as she said, "We never meant for it to go this far," and I almost laughed at the absurdity of that statement, because there is no accidental version of years-long deception. She cried, told me she loved me, told me she felt betrayed by my coldness, and then asked carefully if there was any way to make this stop without destroying everyone. And that was the moment I understood the core of it. To her, justice was destruction only when it threatened her comfort. I told her I wasn't doing this to hurt anyone, but I wasn't going to pretend nothing happened, and she hung up without saying goodbye. The backlash intensified after that, rumors, insinuations, a distant cousin sending me an article about children who sue their parents, as if it were a warning, and yet, amid the noise, something inside me steadied, because for the first time I wasn't reacting, I was choosing. When Marcus informed me that my parents had begun quietly liquidating certain non-essential assets despite the freeze, skirting the edges of compliance, it was less shocking than confirming, because it proved they were still trying to stay ahead of consequences. That attempt backfired spectacularly when the court sanctioned them for partial non-disclosure, a small but symbolic win that shifted leverage in our favor. I remember sitting in Marcus's office after that ruling, the weight of it settling in, and realizing that no matter how this ended, the family I thought I'd lost was already gone. What remained now was a reckoning between who they believed they were and what they'd actually done. And the closer that reckoning got, the more desperate their moves became, setting the stage for a confrontation none of us could avoid, and a truth that would finally force everything into the open. By the time the court scheduled the preliminary hearing, the tension had reached a level where even routine moments felt electrically charged, like the air before a storm you know will break something when it finally hits. And I could feel my parents scrambling behind the scenes to regain control of a narrative that was slipping through their fingers. Marcus warned me that hearings like this were often less about verdicts and more about leverage, about showing each side how much damage could realistically be done, and that knowledge hung over everything like a countdown. In the days leading up to it, my mom sent a series of messages she never would have dared send before, half apologies wrapped in accusations, emotional memories weaponized into arguments, reminders of sacrifices I'd never asked for, all carefully avoiding the word money, as if naming it might summon consequences faster. My dad stayed silent, which was almost worse, because his silence had always meant calculation, not reflection. Claire, on the other hand, unraveled. She left me a voicemail late one night, her voice shaking, accusing me of ruining her life, saying she'd made plans based on promises, that she'd been told the money was family money, that she was supposed to be secure, and hearing that word again, supposed, made something click because entitlement doesn't grow in a vacuum. It's taught, reinforced, normalized. Marcus listened to the voicemail and nodded grimly, explaining that it supported a theory we'd been building quietly. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was redistribution, a long-term reallocation of resources away from me, and toward a version of the family my parents preferred, one where I stayed dependent and invisible while others thrived. The night before the hearing I barely slept, not out of fear but out of anticipation, because something deep in my gut told me this was where the truth would stop being abstract and start being undeniable. The courthouse itself was sterile and unremarkable, the kind of place where life-altering decisions happen under fluorescent lights, and when I walked in with Marcus, I saw my parents sitting together on a bench, my mom clutching her purse like a shield, my dad staring straight ahead, jaw clenched, and for a moment the image almost triggered pity, until I remembered the years of quiet manipulation that had led us here. They didn't look at me when I sat down, but I could feel my mom's awareness like heat on my skin. The hearing moved quickly at first, procedural matters, statements of intent, but then Marcus presented the memo my father had written years ago, the one outlining a strategy to maintain control over the trust by framing me as unstable, and the room changed. The judge leaned forward, asked pointed questions, and for the first time I saw something close to panic flicker across my dad's face, because intent is hard to explain away, especially when it's written in your own words. My parents' attorney tried to reframe it as concerned parental planning, but the language was too precise, too deliberate, and the judge ordered expanded discovery on the spot, including communications and financial records that my parents had fought hard to keep private. That ruling landed like a seismic shift, and I could feel the balance tilt. During a recess, my mom approached me in the hallway, her eyes red, her voice low and urgent as she whispered that there was more to this than I understood, that she'd been trying to protect me from something, and that if I pushed further I'd open doors that shouldn't be opened, and the phrasing struck me as odd, not protective but warning, like she was afraid of something beyond the legal consequences. Before I could ask what she meant, my dad pulled her away, his grip on her arm too tight, his expression cold and controlled, and in that moment I saw a dynamic I'd never allowed myself to see clearly before. My mom wasn't the architect, she was the accomplice, and my dad was the one steering. After the hearing, Marcus told me the expanded discovery would likely expose everything, every transfer, every justification, every lie, and that settlements were often offered at this stage to avoid total exposure. Sure enough, within days, my parents' attorney reached out with a proposal that would have sounded generous to an outsider. A lump sum payment, a confidentiality agreement, mutual non-disparagement, and a quiet end to the matter. Marcus read it, then looked at me and said, "They're trying to buy silence," and I felt a strange calm wash over me, because the offer confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. There was something in those records that scared them more than losing money. When we declined, the retaliation was swift and emotional. My mom left a voicemail sobbing about how she'd failed as a mother. My dad sent a clipped email accusing me of greed and ingratitude. And Claire posted vague messages online about betrayal that drew sympathetic comments from people who had no idea what they were co-signing. But beneath the noise, the legal machinery kept moving, and as documents came in, a darker picture emerged. Communications between my parents discussing how to manage me long-term, how to ensure I never had direct access to assets, how to position themselves as indispensable, and reading those messages felt like discovering you'd been living inside someone else's strategy. The most unsettling part wasn't the money, it was the casualness, the way my life was discussed like a variable to be optimized. Marcus flagged one email chain in particular, noting that it referenced a contingency plan if I ever became unmanageable, involving formal separation and narrative control, and suddenly my mom's exile text read less like an emotional outburst and more like the execution of a plan drafted years in advance. As the pieces clicked together, the story I told myself about my family finally collapsed, replaced by something colder and clearer, and I realized that whatever truth was still hidden, whatever my mom had hinted at in that hallway, was likely the final justification they'd been using all along. And as discovery continued, one name kept appearing in the margins of documents, someone tangential but consistent, someone whose involvement raised questions Marcus couldn't answer yet, but promised would matter. That name, and what it represented, was about to drag the last, most devastating secret into the light. The name that kept appearing in the margins of those documents belonged to someone I hadn't thought about in years, someone my parents always described vaguely and dismissively, like an old footnote that didn't matter anymore. Daniel Brooks, my dad's longtime business partner, a man who'd been present at family events when I was younger, who shook my hand too formally, who always seemed to leave conversations the moment I walked into a room, and the more Marcus's team dug, the clearer it became. That Daniel wasn't peripheral at all. He was structural. His firm had advised on the trust's investments, his signature appeared as a witness on amendments, and his email exchanges with my father were blunt in a way family conversations never were, discussing risk exposure, narrative management, and containment strategies if I ever became aware of the full scope of assets tied to my name. Reading those emails felt like peeling back the last layer of denial, because there was no parental language there, no concern masquerading as care, just strategy and profit and a shared understanding that I was a problem to be managed, not a son to be protected. Marcus requested Daniel's deposition, and when the notice went out, my parents panicked in a way they hadn't before, because within hours my dad called Marcus directly, breaking protocol, abandoning pretense, demanding to know how far we were willing to go, warning that Daniel's involvement would complicate things, and that word again rang hollow because complicated was just another way of saying exposed. The deposition itself was scheduled quickly, and I wasn't required to attend, but I chose to sit in, because by then I needed to see how deep this went with my own eyes. Daniel arrived looking confident, tailored suit, practiced smile, but that composure cracked the moment Marcus began walking him through emails he clearly assumed would never surface, emails discussing how keeping me financially dependent reduced downstream liability, emails referencing my mental state as a talking point rather than a reality, emails that framed my exclusion from the family as a necessary business decision. When Marcus asked him directly whether he believed I was mentally unfit to manage my own finances, Daniel hesitated just long enough to betray himself before saying he'd relied on information provided by my parents, and Marcus followed up with the question that changed everything. Did you ever independently verify that information? The silence that followed was heavy, and when Daniel finally admitted he hadn't, that he'd trusted my father's assessment, The implication was devastating. Not just that lies had been told, but that they'd been monetized, leveraged, and normalized across years of financial planning. The real turning point came when Marcus presented a single document Daniel hadn't seen before. An early draft of the trust structure, written by my grandfather Richard, explicitly stating that control was to pass fully to me at a specified age, no exceptions, no discretion clauses, and Daniel's face drained of color because that document proved the entire framework my parents had operated under was illegitimate. He tried to backpedal, to suggest amendments, misunderstandings, evolving circumstances, but the paper trail was merciless, and when the deposition ended, Marcus told me quietly that Daniel's testimony had just torpedoed any remaining defense. News of what happened traveled fast because that evening my mom showed up at my apartment unannounced, alone this time, her confidence gone, her voice barely steady as she asked if she could come in. I should have said no, but I didn't because part of me needed to hear what she would say when there was nothing left to hide behind. She sat on the edge of my couch like a guest afraid of overstaying her welcome and told me, through tears, that things had gotten out of hand, that she'd trusted my dad to handle finances responsibly, that she'd convinced herself it was temporary, that once I was ready, things would be made right, and I listened, feeling a strange mix of sadness and detachment because even now, she was framing the harm as an accident rather than a choice. When I asked her about the contingency plans, about the narrative they'd built around my instability, about the exile text, she closed her eyes and admitted that she'd been afraid. Afraid of losing her marriage, afraid of conflict, afraid that if she didn't go along everything would collapse, and that fear had turned into compliance, compliance into complicity. The most painful moment came when I asked her why they decided to cut me off so completely instead of talking to me, and she whispered, "Because once you knew we couldn't control how angry you'd be." And in that answer was the clearest admission of all. This had never been about my well-being. It had always been about their comfort. She left without asking forgiveness, maybe because she knew it wasn't something she could ask for yet, or maybe because she understood that forgiveness wouldn't undo years of calculated harm. The following week, Marcus called with news that felt almost surreal in its finality. Daniel Brooks had agreed to cooperate fully, providing additional records in exchange for leniency, and those records confirmed that not only had my parents misused trust funds, they'd also leveraged my assets as collateral in business dealings without my knowledge, exposing me to risk they'd never disclosed. That revelation shifted the case from civil breach to potential criminal liability, and when Marcus explained what that meant, real consequences, not just repayment, I felt a knot loosen in my chest, not because I wanted them punished but because for the first time the system was seeing what I'd lived. My parents' attorney requested an emergency settlement meeting, the tone markedly different now, urgent, conciliatory, and when Marcus asked me how I wanted to proceed, I realized I wasn't driven by revenge anymore. I was driven by closure. We agreed to meet, knowing that whatever was said there would be the last attempt to contain the damage, the final performance before the truth became public record. And as I prepared for that meeting, I understood that the family I'd lost wasn't going to be recovered in that room, but the person I'd been reduced to for their convenience was finally going to be restored, no matter what it cost them. The settlement meeting took place in a glass-walled conference room that felt more like a pressure chamber than a place for resolution. And as I sat across from my parents for the first time since everything unraveled, I realized how small they looked without the armor of authority and secrecy they'd worn my entire life. My dad avoided my eyes completely, shuffling papers he no longer controlled, while my mom kept glancing at me with a fragile hope that I might still save her from the consequences she'd helped create. And Claire sat stiffly beside them, her expression caught somewhere between resentment and fear, because the future she'd been promised was evaporating in real time. Their attorney spoke first, outlining terms in a rehearsed voice: full restitution of misused funds, transfer of full control of the trust to me, additional compensation for damages, and a quiet, sealed resolution that would keep everything out of criminal court. And as he spoke, I understood the irony of it all. After years of controlling my life through money, they were now offering money as an apology. Marcus looked at me, silently reminding me that the decision was mine, and in that moment every memory rushed in. The years of being told I wasn't ready, the nights of stress I could have avoided, the exile text that tried to erase me like an inconvenience. And instead of anger, what I felt was a profound, steady clarity. I told them I would agree to restitution and transfer of control, but I would not agree to silence, not fully, because accountability loses its meaning when it's hidden, and while I didn't want public spectacle, I refused to protect the narrative that had harmed me. The room went quiet, and for the first time my dad looked up, his voice tight as he asked what I wanted. Really? And I answered honestly. I want my life back, and I want you to stop pretending you did this out of love. That broke something open because my mom started crying openly, not performative this time but exhausted, and Claire whispered that she didn't know who she was without the safety net she'd assumed was hers, and I realized then that the karmic twist wasn't just financial, it was existential. Everything they'd built their identities around had depended on my silence, and now that silence was gone. The agreement was finalized weeks later, the trust transferred fully into my control, the remaining assets restored, and additional funds set aside to cover legal costs and penalties, and when the papers were signed I expected to feel triumphant, but what I felt instead was light, like something heavy had finally been set down. Criminal charges were narrowly avoided through cooperation and restitution, but the consequences didn't stop there. My dad lost key business relationships once Daniel's cooperation became known, my parents were forced to sell the house they'd renovated with money that wasn't theirs, and Claire had to rebuild her life without the cushion she'd mistaken for entitlement. And watching that unfold wasn't satisfying so much as sobering, because it proved a truth I'd learned the hard way: systems built on control collapse the moment control is challenged. I didn't cut them off entirely after that, but the relationship that remained was distant, honest in a way it had never been before, stripped of illusion and obligation, and for the first time I wasn't performing a role just to belong. I moved quietly into a life that felt like my own, made choices without asking permission, invested in my future with transparency and confidence, and rebuilt my sense of self not around money, but around autonomy. The greatest irony of all was that once the truth came out, once the fear lost its grip, the wealth they'd hidden from me mattered far less than the freedom it unlocked, because what they'd really stolen wasn't just money. It was time, trust, and self-belief, and reclaiming those was the real victory. When I look back now at that message my mom sent, the one meant to exile me, I see it for what it truly was. Not an ending but a last attempt to keep a lie alive. It failed. And in failing it gave me something no trust fund ever could, the unshakable knowledge that I survived the worst betrayal of my life, confronted it head-on and walked away whole, not because I was protected, but because I finally protected myself. For more intense family drama stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel.